This is Revelation BIB 406, Lecture 10, and today we are going to explore Chapter 12 of the Book of Revelation. Just as a quick review, we want to jump back to Chapter 11. In Chapter 11, we had the measurement of the temple. John was given a reed and was told to go and take measurements of the Temple of Jerusalem. We had the two witnesses being described. We talked about possible identification of these two witnesses and based on your interpretive grid, how you might see those two witnesses. And then we had the seventh trumpet blast. So the final trumpet was sounded in chapter 11. So now let's go to chapter 12. First of all, we want to mention that chapters 12 through 14 are parenthetical, so in terms of the sequence of events, there's not going to be any new event that takes place. These are all happening simultaneous with the sounding of that seventh trumpet. So this is all parenthetical information here in the next three chapters. There are 7 different characters that are introduced to us in chapter 12, and it's going to be important for you to know information about these 7. You don't have to memorize the details of the characters, but you need to be able to recognize like a true-false question or a multiple choice or a matching situation, match up the way these characters are described and be able to identify them. So let's look at these 7. You have the woman that represents Israel. You have the dragon, who is representing Satan. You have a male child who represents Christ. Michael, who represents the angel. And then you have Israel, the remnant of the woman's seed, the beast out of the sea, which would be the world dictators, and the beast out of the earth, which could be seen as the false prophets or religious leaders of the world. So these are the 7 characters that are introduced to us here in chapter 12. Many commentators have mentioned that chapter 12 of Revelation is the most symbolic chapter in the entire book. So a lot of symbolism. Even those who would lean toward a very literal interpretation of the book would still allow for a lot of symbolism to be going on here in chapter 12. John himself describes the events of this chapter by using the word sign. So if you go to chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "There appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars." So he describes this as a great wonder and seems to describe it as being symbolic. All right, women are often used to refer to organizations or systems in the book of Revelation, and we're going to see the woman who represents Israel talked about, and then other descriptions of women are going to be given throughout the rest of the book that we'll get to in upcoming lectures. Here will be some of those. Jezebel is associated with a religious system of false teaching back in Revelation 2. The great harlot is associated with false religion in Revelation 17. And then the bride is associated with the church in Revelation 19, verses 7 through 8. All right, so those will be important to know for an upcoming test. Jezebel, the great harlot, and the bride, and what they are associated with. All right, he says another sign in verse 3. It says there appeared another wonder or sign. So in verse 1, it says there was a wonder or a sign that appeared in heaven. And then verse 3, a second sign, and it is the dragon. It says a great red dragon having 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. Seiss made this comment about the dragon. He said, God never made an evil being, but he made angels, principalities, and powers capacitated for mighty joys and distinctions in his glorious domain, yet with free will. implied in the very creation of moral beings, which they could exercise for their everlasting weal or woe. Many have remained steadfast, to wit, Michael and his angels, but some abode not in the truth, but revolted against the rule of heaven and became unchanging enemies of God and his kingdom. So that's a great commentary on the idea of God creating, this dragon or evil being described here in verse 3. Some say Michael must be Jesus because his name means one like God. But if this were a title of Jesus, it would argue against his deity. I'm not for it, because it would say that Jesus is like God but not God. There is also an unquestionable God-likeness in all holy beings, which must be very exalted in those preeminent among the ministers of the throne. So this is an explanation against those who would say that Michael would be a picture of or a type of Christ, or maybe even Jesus. Seiss would argue against that. All right, so you have the war in heaven talked about from verses 7 through 17. And if you go to verse 7, it says there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. And we just read that description or commentary from Seiss, and he was saying that he did not think Michael is Jesus, and I agree. Some have made that argument going to this verse and saying this is a description of the battle between Jesus and Satan, but it's very clear here that Michael is the one leading the angels of God into battle. So this is a battle between Michael and the devil, and Satan loses. It says in verse 8, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven, talking about the dragon and his angels. So the great dragon was cast out in verse 9, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now is come salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ, for the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. So Satan is removed from heaven, his angels are cast out with him, and the blood of Christ is emphasized as being key to the victory that's being described here. Some have argued that this is commentary on an event that happened in the past, that this would not be something that's going to happen in the future, but this is just going back to a battle that occurred maybe even before creation, or sometime early, after creation, but still early in the history of time. So different theories have been proposed in terms of when this actual battle took place, and you can read more into that, and depending upon your interpretive grid, it's going to make a difference as to how you see that. In a dispensational model, the woman would represent Israel, and then the rest of her offspring talked about in this chapter would be the believing Gentiles in the tribulation in a dispensational model.